He is a Filipino banker, business executive, and diplomat, the seventh governor of the Central Bank of the Philippines, and former Philippine Ambassador to the United States. He is president and CEO of Philem Life Insurance Co., then the largest life insurance company in the Philippines. Currently, he's chairman of FWD Life Insurance Co. and non-executive director of FINMA Corp. and FINMA Inc. With us now for Thought Leaders, Ambassador Jose Joey Cuisia Jr. Good to see you, Joey. Welcome to the program.
It's good to see you too, Cathy, and it's good to be back here
In the Philippines after about 6 weeks?
Just got back here.
Wow, you've been
after
away.
about 6 weeks of traveling in Europe, yeah.
And the U.S.?
No, just Europe.
I see. And it came at a time when the debt ceiling bill in the U.S. with President Biden had really been hanging in the balance. And a lot of people around the globe were watching whether he'd sign the bill.
Yeah.
Or else the government would lose some cash to pay its bills and would cause some sort of a global catastrophic financial collapse, like they say.
Yes.
But what did you see from your end, having traveled abroad in the West?
Well, as you said, I think everybody was really watching very closely, especially the bankers, the central bankers around the world, because, you know, it was a very key decision on the part of the U.S. Congress. And I'm glad that they, in fact, heeded the advice of Secretary Janet Yellen, because it really could have been catastrophic, not just for the U.S., but for the, I guess, entire global financial system, if the U.S. would have defaulted on any of its debts. No?
What impact could it have, or would it have had on the Philippines, considering we're an ally of the U.S. and your background as a banker, a business executive, and diplomat?
I think it's more the disruptions that it would cause in the global financial system, because, you know, one default could trigger cross defaults, and so the whole banking system would be really subject to a lot of uncertainty, and so even other financial systems like the Philippine financial system could suffer from an adverse impact of that kind of a decision, no, by the U.S. government. But fortunately, they decided to lift the ceiling. But for how long, we of course don't know, because I think there's going to be discussions again between the Republicans and the Democrats about what kind of a reasonable ceiling that they will impose at a later date.
What do you think Biden's chances are of winning a second term? Because he's announced that he would like to run for office.
Yes, I think it depends on who's going to run against him. And as it is now, it seems that Trump is leading the Republicans in terms of the poll results. He is way ahead of DeSantis. And I think that if Biden were to run against Trump, I think Biden will probably still win. Now, of course, his age is one of the factors that the Republican rivals are going to point to. But I think if he continues to remain healthy, then I think he has a better chance to win over Trump.
And Biden's bid for a second term comes as we're seeing increasing conflict again at the West Philippine Sea. What are you seeing in the way of progress when it comes to the U.S. as an ally of the Philippines?
But one of the things I see about Biden is he's been able to keep the coalition together, the coalition that's supporting Ukraine, which is, I think, quite impressive. Despite the fact that, of course, the Republicans have been bringing out the fact that the U.S. has provided so much assistance already to Ukraine. There are some, in fact, who are raising objections to additional financial support. But I think the majority, both of the Democrats and the Republicans, are still in favor of supporting Ukraine. And so are the EU nations. They are supporting Ukraine. So that I think is to the credit of Joe Biden, that he's been able to keep that coalition together.
And when it comes to the West Philippine Sea, how far ahead do you think the Biden administration has had when it comes to protecting our own
Well,
interests.
they have
in the West Philippine Sea.
reiterated the ironclad commitment that was first initiated by Secretary of the Foreign Affairs Secretary under President Trump. And, you know, they have continued with that commitment. And in fact, Secretary Blinken has mentioned it. Secretary Austin, the Defense Secretary, has reiterated the ironclad commitment, and President Biden himself has mentioned it. So that gives us a lot of comfort when they tell us that their commitment to defend the Philippines is ironclad. Remember, that was not true in the case of the Obama administration. I recall that when Secretary Hillary Clinton came to the Philippines, one of the questions that was asked about her was precisely what happens if there was an attack on a Philippine vessel in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. And her response was that we do not respond to hypothetical questions, you know. So obviously she was trying to avoid giving a direct answer. But in the case of Secretary Pompeo, he was more direct and said, our commitment is ironclad. That was during the time of President Trump.
But what progress has there been? I mean, we've crossed 7 years of the arbitral rule in the West Philippine Sea, and still we're seeing incursions and
Unfortunately,
conflict.
when President Duterte took over in 2016, we lost a lot of time because you recall he did not want to antagonize the Chinese authorities. So he sort of put that decision, the arbitral decision, on the back burner. And you recall he even mentioned his decision to pivot towards China, which I think was, in my opinion, a mistake. We lost a lot of time because the U.S. was ready to start developing those sites under EDCA. There were 5 agreed upon sites for development. That would have helped both the Philippines and the U.S. But when President Duterte decided to set aside the arbitral, you know, the Philippine military could not do its part. That they had to do for the U.S. to also start putting in money for the development of those sites. For example, development of airstrips in some of those sites. No? So all that work had to be suspended. So we lost a lot of time during the 6 years of President Duterte.
Are we making up any ground so far in what you're seeing for the past year?
That they're trying to accelerate the development of the sites based on what I've read in the papers. No, at least the 5 original sites. Now the 4 new ones, I think it may take some time to get to develop those 4 additional sites. So they're focusing on the original 5 sites that were agreed upon.
And that takes us back to the Mutual Defense Treaty. I mean, this has been there for 7 years, so years, and the U.S. and the Philippines just agreed last May they're going to work on new guidelines. But where are we in working those new guidelines in the way that Washington would engage the Philippines when it needed to?
Yeah, you recall that was signed in 1951. So it's more than 70 years. Now, I think they would like to discuss certain issues there that probably need some refinements. For example, one of the irritants has been custody of American servicemen who have committed crimes, for example. Up to now, under the current agreements, including the EDCA, the U.S. continues to exercise custody of the American servant until he is convicted. No? Okay, once he is convicted, then they have to surrender custody to the Philippine government. But until such time that the American servant has not been convicted, the U.S. continues to have, and that has been criticized by a number of our lawmakers. So probably that's one of the areas that they will be trying to, find some mutually agreeable solution. No?
Are there other sticking points?
Yes,
I mean, we
there are
can't
some
move
others,
forward
but
if
probably
we don't get rid of
not
these.
as major as the custody issue.
In
For example,
redefining.
taxes. They
Right.
say, why is it that the U.S. not paying any taxes when they bring in equipment, etc., etc.? They don't pay rent. So many things but these are probably less controversial than the custody issue.
Some of the analysts have argued that perhaps it would work better for us if we had a more ambiguous mutual defense treaty. Do you agree?
Well, the fact that it has worked over the last 50, how many, 70 years is yes, there are ambiguous provisions, but it has worked. And we've been able to, except that it has caused some irritants, particularly among a small group of lawmakers. So it's probably best to try to see if we can resolve it. But I think what's more important is to keep that treaty alive, because we need the U.S. And of course, the U.S. also needs the Philippines, no? Especially because of the efforts of China to control a bigger part of the region. As you know, they have, in fact, occupied some sites which are part of the economic zone, Philippine economic zone. And, they claim to be our friends, but as former senior associate Justice Tony Carver, how can they be friends when they grab territory from us? And I agree with him. And that's one of the things probably that has to be resolved between China and the Philippines. So.
And in the meantime, we're seeing our Philippine Coast Guard and the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, increasing patrols over the contested waters. What do you make of joint patrols with the U.S. and not only the U.S., but allies like Australia and Japan? Because this is a conversation that got started, correct me if I'm mistaken, back in 2015 between the U.S. and the Philippines.
Yeah. In fact, during the last 2 years of the Aquino administration, you will recall, we were pushing for joint patrols. I was with the late Secretary Albert de Rosario, when we met with Secretary John Kerry, who was then Secretary of State of the U.S., and Secretary Albert proposed a joint patrol with the U.S. And at that time, I think the U.S. was not yet ready to say yes, but eventually they did. They decided that they were willing to do joint patrol. It was the time during President Duterte's administration, but President Duterte was not willing to push for it because he knew that it would upset the Chinese authorities. So again, that's another instance where we lost the opportunity precisely getting that joint patrol started much earlier. But now I think they're serious. In fact, they've been discussing it, and from the statements made by Ambassador Romualdez that the U.S. has agreed and the Philippines has agreed. So it's a matter of working out the details. No?
And also in coordination with allies like Australia and Japan. There are other
countries
allies
like Japan, Australia, that are willing to do joint patrols, which I think would also be something good for the Philippines.
What about for joint exploration? Because when you look at our neighbors, Vietnam and Indonesia already started joint exploration in the contested waters.
Yes, but for as long as it is done in accordance with the Constitution. You recall that during time of President Arroyo, they had a joint with Vietnam and China. But that was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But that's way after, the administration of President Arroyo, right? So they have to be very careful in coming up with an agreement that is in accordance with the Constitution.
So it's still a no-go at this point in
time? No,
time?
I think they're looking into it, and they're looking at possible, again, it will depend on whether they can come up with an agreement that would be considered in accordance with the Constitution.
The visit of President Marcos to the U.S. Also yielded an offer from President Biden in creating a first-of-its-kind trade and investment mission to the Philippines. What has been the progress since that discussion started
first,
in May?
Let me point out that there have been trade investment missions to the Philippines, but these are usually organized by the Secretary of Commerce. Like Secretary Pritzker led a delegation during the time of President Benigno Aquino III. She headed that delegation. But the difference is that it's President Biden who's organizing this. So in effect, because he's putting the office of the president, at the head of this delegate, there'll be somebody from the office of the president, a very senior official, probably leading the delegation, and that he himself will be talking to some of the CEOs to convince them to join this delegation. So that's why I say it's first ever, because usually the trade and investment missions are organized by the Secretary of Commerce or the U.S. Trade Representative, which has been done also in the past.
So do you think there could be more opportunities then, given that this is endorsed by President Biden?
Yes. And I think it's a good time because obviously we need foreign direct investments. And the truth is we've not seen very substantial foreign direct investments from the U.S. In the past, remember,
why is that?
U.S. was number one in terms of investments, but they're no longer number one. They're probably number 3 or number 4 now.
How come? How come that's
Well, I think for various reasons. There have been questions about Philippines respecting the rule of law. For example, in the case of Maynilad and Manila Water, you recall what happened in the case of those 2 water concessionaires. The contracts were not respected. They went to arbitration. They won the arbitration cases in Singapore, and yet the Philippine government did not honor their obligation. And so things like that raises questions about the rule of law in the Philippines. And the American investors are very particular about that. So it's taken some time to to convince them that the Philippines respects the rule of law. But it's very difficult when you can point out to 2 large water concessionaires that obviously were not given the right, their rights were not respected by the Philippine government.
And are you getting any positive feedback from the American firms that are willing to explore doing business opportunities? Because the investments are in the fields of innovation, clean energy. And food security.
No, there seems to be a lot of interest now. And it looks like they're now willing to look into this. If you look at it, there's still no commitments of substantial investments from American companies. They are interested, and they're, I guess, looking at the opportunities and, of course, talking to potential local partners. But it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think the good thing is that there is a lot of interest in certain areas, like you said, clean energy or renewable energy, infrastructure, definitely, healthcare. So there are areas where there is a lot of interest. So
what do you think
I think it's very encouraging.
Can do to actually encourage them to put their money here and not just explore, but put their money and invest right now? What needs to be done?
I think, precisely to convince them that the Philippines today is no longer the Philippines during the time of Duterte. It's a different environment. And I think President Bongbong Marcos has in fact gone out of his way to precisely try to convince them, which is good, because he himself has spoken to these American CEOs to assure them that they can expect a level playing field. They can expect that the Philippines will respect their rights. The Philippines will respect the rule of law, etc. He's gone out of his way to do that, to convince them, which is very good.
Are you getting any feedback that investors are considering maybe
yes. I have
a near
some friends,
expanding of the historic momentum?
Right. I have
Washington
some friends who have tell me that they have been talking to American businessmen, CEOs, etc., and they tell me that it's a different kind of environment today. In other words, there's a lot more interest, precisely because they've heard the statements of President Marcos. They've heard the economic managers, and they seem to be more convinced that it's a different environment under the Marcos administration.
And does that include the geopolitical situation that we're facing in the contested waters? Are they hopeful that there would be more advances in
Well,
protecting
of course,
the
they are
Philippines as an
hopeful.
ally of
They're
the
hopeful,
US.
but they're also concerned because they see that China has become even more aggressive. They have been pushing. I mean, you look at the presence of Chinese vessels in Philippine territory, and what have we been able to do? Not much, despite all the diplomatic protests that we have filed. I think over 100 since President Marcos took over. But during the time of President Duterte and even the time of President Aquino, we had so many hundreds of diplomats. And the Chinese just ignored all those diplomatic protests.
But why do you think that is? The continued ignoring of the kind of ironclad reaffirmation that we're getting from Washington, and it's still happening.
The ironclad commitment is if there is an attack on any Philippine vessel. But the fact that they cannot get the Chinese out of our territory unless precisely there is an attack on a Philippine vessel. No? So it's there. So it's up to us, and I think we really need
it's
to
up
do
to
more.
us in what way?
Okay, one that late Secretary Albert was, of course, proposing, and I agreed with his proposal, is that to bring this matter up in all the UN meetings, all the opportunities they have in the United Nations to bring out the fact that China has not been respecting the arbitral truce, that they have ignored it and they refuse to even honor it, and despite the fact that they are a signatory to UNCLOS. So, another country that did that, in the case of Nicaragua, they won a case against the U.S. The U.S. also initially did not respect the decision. But because Nicaragua kept bringing this up in all the meetings they had to try to embarrass the U.S., the U.S. eventually agreed, although they did not say that it was related to that decision, but they settled out of court with Nicaragua. But it took about 10 years. Okay. Now, we have not even done that, the practice to shame China, to bring it out in the open. Although President Duterte mentioned it once during his last address to the UN. That was during his last year as president. He brought it up finally, but that was it, nothing else. Okay. Will President Marcos take it up when he addresses the UN September? I don't know, but he should. And every opportunity that we have, we should. Just to bring out to the international community that China is a rogue nation. They're not respecting the rule of law. They're not respecting the international order. So I think we have to keep shaming them.
What would you like to hear from President Marcos during the State of the Nation address
Well, precisely,
on July
I
24?
hope he will take this up. That he's going to take this up in the United Nations and continue to take until China finally, agrees to respect the decision. But I know it's not gonna be easy. It's not gonna, it'll take many, many years probably to convince China, because they said they will not honor that decision.
And what is your assessment of the first year in office of the current administration?
Well, I think he has done quite well, considering that we were expecting that he might be bungling because he has had no experience, except as a governor of Ilocos Norte, and of course he was a senator. But he chose a very good economic team, and so far the decision to repivot back to the U.S., I welcome that. I think it was a very good decision. So when you look at the economy has done relatively well. We had 7.2% growth last year, and in the first quarter, I think we did quite well, 6.4%. So the economy, despite the challenges, despite the problem we had during the pandemic, has done relatively well, especially in relation to the other ASEAN countries. And for 2023, I was surprised to see that third-party think tanks have projected that the Philippines will have the highest growth rate for 2023 and possibly even 2024. So that's very encouraging to see. Because you recall that when the pandemic broke out, the Philippines had the largest economic contraction, 9.6%. And of course, it took time before we recovered, but we had a very good recovery in 2021 and then 2022. And now, this third party, the Axios, it's a think tank, said that we should end up with a 6.4% growth rate, which is quite good, higher than Vietnam and higher than Indonesia and the other ASEAN countries. No? So that's quite encouraging. The economic team was projecting 6 to 7%, and so that 6.4 is within that target. Some of our private economists were actually saying that we'll probably have a growth rate less than 6%, 5.8, 5.7%. So it's good to see that there are others, even external economists, who are projecting a better growth rate for the Philippines. So.
Pension reform is now in the news as the Finance Department finishes up consultations with all the stakeholders before Congress reopens.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best way to manage pension reform for our uniformed personnel? Because the Finance Department has to find a means to fund the pension so that it can support the ones in active personnel.
Yeah. That's a very tricky question, and it's going to be very difficult. But I think what they're doing now is to talk to the current enlisted men, the officers, and explaining to them that keeping the pension reform, the pension system as is not sustainable. And at some point, if they don't do anything about it now, their pensions will not be paid, the government will not be able to pay. So let's work on this together. And that's the right approach. Get them involved and let them discuss what are the options. It's not going to be easy because, some of these listenermen and even the officer will say, oh, we were not paying anything before. Why should we pay? But all the GSIS members, the SSS members, have a counterpart contribution. Why shouldn't they have a counterpart contribution? I think, again, it is a big mistake on the part of President Duterte, who was trying to, get the military on his side, get the police on his side, comes out with a, decision. Unfortunately, that cannot be sustained. But he didn't think about that. I mean, all he thought was at that time, how to please these soldiers, how to please the policemen. But the government would not be able to sustain that in the long run. So it was an irresponsible decision.
One of the key pieces of the Finance Department's proposal is a joint contribution between the government, military personnel, and the uniformed personnel.
Well, that's probably what they're working on, because that's precisely the case in the case of the GSIS.
And that's something that we could.
The government has the bigger portion of it, but the government employees also contribute a portion of their salaries.
And do you think that this would be a mutually acceptable bill to all concerned stakeholders?
I think that they can work out something that's mutually acceptable to both the military and then to the government. No, if the military recognize that this currency is not sustainable, they have to understand that and accept that. So then, what do we do? Then they have to work it out together. Of course, they will want their contribution to be as small as possible, right? And of course, government has to figure how much it can afford.
Of course, because there could be the threat of a fiscal collapse. I mean,
Yes,
is that something
exactly.
that's not unthinkable? It's something that could happen.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, pension reform is just one of the many reforms the Finance Department is considering. The others include rationalization of government bureaucracy, making it more efficient, and other mechanisms to raise revenues. What would you recommend?
Well, I am not an expert, even though I was with the SSS. I think what we have to probably keep in mind, that when they come out with pension payments, etc., because the problem of SSS also is that, our politicians sometimes they just increase the pensions without really having an actuarial study. You need to have an actuarial study to ensure that whatever increases you provide will be sustainable over the long term. And sometimes our politicians forget that. And that's why whether it's GSIS, whether it's SSS, or whether it's this military pension, they have to rely on actuarial studies. So the even finance people have to rely on the actuarial people who who do these studies, because these are long-term payments. You have to go 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, to be able to determine what is a sustainable system.
In terms of generating revenues for public funds, the Maharlika investment bill has already reached the president's desk for signature on July 5th. In terms of getting the highest returns possible, what do you think is the best way forward? And not only that, but to best manage the developmental aspect of the Maharlika investment fund.
Again, to be honest with you, I was against the Maharlika fund. Why? Because Maharlika fund or sovereign wealth fund, that was the concept, was if you have excess funds. We don't have excess funds. In fact, we're still a net bar. We have huge debts. So where is the excess funds coming from? You're going to get it from DBP, you're going to be land bank. Well, land bank and DBP will be affected. They're not going to be able to accomplish the mandates that they were supposed to under their charters, because they'll have less funds to do that. Whatever they will contribute, say 50 billion part land bank, 25 billion part of DBP, that's going to affect their lending capacity. Okay, so it's not really excess. If you look at Indonesia, if you look at Norway, their wealth funds were based on excess funds they were getting, say, from oil sales and so on. So they have a wealth fund. They say, okay, we'll make use of this excess fund to ensure that we provide for future services. Okay, but that's not the case of the Philippine fund. You're getting it from this institution. Now, in the case of the central bank or the BSP, the dividends that were supposed to be plowed back as additional capital will down be by Maharlika. But what happens to the buildup of capital of the BSP, which is very important, is needed, right? That will again be delayed by so many years, because that money that should have gone to the capital buildup will go to the Maharlika fund. And that's why I thought the position of then Governor Philip Nadal was correct. He says, no, we should not touch it. But eventually, I think he yielded, when some pressure was put on him. And so he agreed to give the dividends that would have gone to the capital buildup to government for the Maharlika fund. No?
Well, as soon as the law takes effect, we'll need to discuss the implementing rules and regulations, and along that, finding staffing for the Maharlika Investment Corporation.
Yeah.
Who do you think would make the cut to staff the Maharlika Investment Corporation?
I don't know. It's going to be very difficult to get from the private sector to work in government when they know that there are so many limitations, but at the same time, you need safeguards, right? And I don't blame the senators who say, well, we have to put all of these safeguards because look at what happened to Malaysia, the 1MDB fund, etc. And so I said, yeah, I wouldn't want to be in that situation. In other words, if they asked me, can you come in to be one of the investors? I would politely decline and say, no matter what compensation.
You can't be convinced.
No. So I think it's going to be very difficult. But I think there will be maybe young people who might be willing to take a chance and say, well, let's see if I can work in government. I have been an advocate to do public service, no? But when you're going into a situation where you find that it's going to be a very, say, the spotlight's going to be on you, and you cannot do what you think is best because there's everyone looking over your shoulders, then Do you want to be in that kind of situation? I certainly would not want to be. No. So I don't know. It's going to be tough getting the right people now. But that's so important, getting the right type of people for the Maharlika Fund. It's going to be a big challenge. Now you said to get the highest yield. You know, when you remember, when you try to look at risk return, if you want a higher return, you take also greater risks. That's given. So at the same time, you know that they say, oh, why are you putting the funds of the government at risk? You have to be very careful with those funds. But how do you want to get higher yields? You have to take some risks. So that's a situation that these guys are going to be in. That's why I said I wouldn't want to be in their shoes.
And that you considered it a tricky situation. You've mentioned Felipe Medalla. What do you make of the new central bank governor, Bangko Sentral Governor
Eli Remolona. I think a very good choice. He's a professional central banker. I recall that when I was in the central bank, I invited him to be part of a committee that was headed by former Prime Minister Cesar Virata to look into the opening of branches for foreign banks. So he was one of the committeemen, and I was very grateful that he accepted. So they did a very good job. I've seen his, work with the New York Federal Reserve. He has been with the Bank of International. So he's a professional central banker. So his expertise and his experience will be very useful. And I think it's a very wise decision on the part of President Marcos to have appointed him as BSP governor.
But Governor Remolona's acceptance comes at a time we're still looking at inflation. It's come off over the past 5 months, but borrowing costs are still at a 16-year high. Yeah. How do you think he'll navigate and bring inflation down
I
to the target
confident because
4% target?
He is a monetary policy expert. So he knows very well what are the pros and cons, what are the factors that to look at in terms of managing inflation. And I think that there's no better choice than Governor Remolona in this particular situation.
It's going to be an uphill climb because when you look at the significant central banks around the world, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, Bank of England, they've all said they're far from over in hiking rates.
Yes.
So we're looking at a situation where we're taking a pause in rates, but interest rates are still going up in the West.
Well, but fortunately in our case, I think inflation is easing. And again, the central bank, what they were saying is that Governor Remolona is very data dependent. That's very true. He looks at data very, very closely, which is the right thing to do. So I am confident that he's going to do well in terms of managing inflation.
Well, recall
and
for
managing the entire BSP.
Yeah, now that you mentioned the BSP, it was still central bank when you took the helm back in 2011, in the 90s, in fact, in the 90s, 1991. Recall for us that moment when you decided, along with the monetary board members, of a partial lifting of foreign exchange controls.
Yeah.
Because that ushered in what we know now as foreign direct investments.
Yes.
Looking back in hindsight, how did the decision making go within the board, and what impact do you think it made many, many decades on?
Well, first, you may recall that at that time, our reserves were very, very small. Today, we have over 100 billion. At that time, when I stepped down as central bank, it was 6.7. But in 1991, it was probably about between $3 to $4 billion. Okay, we were still, faced with huge challenges, and precisely, there were objections from senior central bank officials about lifting the controls because they were concerned that our reserves could immediately be wiped out. But I looked at it differently. And fortunately, the other monetary board members like Secretary Stanislao, Secretary Padaranga, agreed with my view. And so I got the support of the monetary board to make the first phase was in 1991. We did partial lifting of controls. And the second phase was in 1992. And, once we did after 1990, we saw foreign direct investments increasing very substantially. So it was the reverse of what they were afraid of, the senior, central bank officials. Now, of course, I was very happy about that, but I didn't know when we made that decision whether the decision was going to be correct. But it proved correct after a few years, after completed the second phase. And since then, you see that there have been further relaxation of controls and reforms that have precisely enabled central bank to build up its foreign exchange reserves to over $100 billion.
But it also exposed us to the global financial crisis, the pandemic, and the realities of just being linked to the global financial system. So there's also the downside of being so exposed to what's going on overseas.
Yes, in 1997, with the crisis, we faced precisely big challenge in terms of our reserves being wiped out because precisely you saw what happened in Thailand. They defended the Thai baht, and within a few weeks they lost $40 billion. Now, in the case of the BSP, Governor Singson was then governor, he decided to let the peso depreciate and seek its own level. So it hit 56 from 24, 25. Then it started improving. Well, today, of course, we're back at 56. But that was in 1997 when the Thai baht hit 56, ahead of the Philippine peso. But look, the Thai baht is now at about 35, whereas the Philippine peso is still around 55, 56. No?
Interesting that you mentioned that when you made that decision, and it was a split board, the younger ones deciding against what the senior bankers were saying within the monetary board, you still didn't think that this would work out. But
well,
yet
it was
you
not
took
so much because of whether the younger or because we were not that young anymore. Well, I guess I was the youngest in the monetary board, but because we had Secretary Estanislao, Secretary Diokno, Secretary Padaranga. Yeah, I'm not Diokno, Padaranga. Who else? Secretary Roy Navarro. It was monetary board against the, I guess, opinion of the central bankers, the officers of the central bank, who had been there for many. And the reason was that they were used to controls. In other words, they grew up in an environment of control, so they were afraid to let go. But I said that now, we have no choice because this is the only way we will be able to convince foreign investors to bring in their money here into the Philippines. And I think our decision proved to be correct because years after, look at what happened to the Philippines, And remember, 10 years, 1993, we went back to the international capital markets. Our first bond was very successful, and the rest is history. So today, we even enjoy an investment credit rating, investment grade credit rating. So, when we look back, I think it was the right decision.
Now talk to us about the Philippine insurance industry, because when you look at the penetration rate, it's still below 3%,
Yes.
especially when you consider the poor section of society there.
Yes.
What do you think is holding it
we
back,
have one
and
of
what
the lowest,
can be done?
one of the lowest penetration rates in ASEAN, unfortunately. And I think it's also because maybe the insurance companies have not done such a good job in educating the people how important, life insurance is to them. But I'm also glad to see that micro insurance has grown quite rapidly, maybe in the last 5-10 years. The opportunities are there. And a company, for example, FWD Life, which is one of the youngest life insurance companies today, we were set up only in 2014. We're doing very well because we're using digital tools. We're one of the, I guess, first companies to really use digital tools. And so in 2020, we did very well with the pandemic because even prior to 2020, we were already shifting to digital tools. No? So I think that will probably help us reach out to the younger generation. So I am very confident that the opportunities for the life insurance are still very bright.
But in terms of shifting consumer habits, it's often said that Filipinos would rather hear from an insurance agent. They don't really seek out insurance, life insurance, in fact, even after a pandemic when it's taken so
Yes.
many lives.
Yes.
How can you change those habits?
No, but we're seeing that we're selling more and more online. We're seeing, and there's no. Of course, sometimes we do Zoom meetings with them if they want to talk to the agent. But we're seeing a very encouraging trend in terms of online sales of life insurance, and I think the other companies are also likewise seeing good, very encouraging trend in terms of selling online.
So digitalization will improve penetration rates
Yes.
to above
Oh,
3%.
definitely,
Do you
yeah.
have maybe a double-digit target?
Well,
at a certain
you know,
point?
it's gonna take time. We're probably in the 2.5% penetration rate right now, but other countries are 5, 6, 7%. So there's still a long way to go. But that means there's also a lot of opportunities, no? Yeah.
There is indeed. To scale it even twice, and that's the opportunity that we
Yes.
still see in the insurance industry. Just before we go, Joey, I know that when this interview airs on July 18th,
Okay.
you would have already turned 79. Happy birthday,
Thank
Ambassador
you.
Joey.
Thank you.
That's just amazing. Nearly 80, but you're so energetic. I mean, we're
Well,
talking here for nearly
I
an
work
hour.
out practically every day. So I do an hour on the treadmill. So I try to keep, and I also watch, well, my diet.
Okay.
But at least not when I was traveling. I have to admit, my diet, I just forgot about that, because how can you give up on good Spanish food or Italian food or French food? I said, no diet.
Right,
but I
time
have
spent.
started my diet again here.
That's
Yeah.
good. And it's time spent with Vicky and your grandchildren. I mean, at last count, I only counted 3, but you
Yes.
said you
Now
had more
5.
than that.
We have
5.
yes. And the youngest is 2 years old. So I hope we'll have more. Yeah.
And I know that you had plans with Vicky in establishing a Philippine American young leadership
Yes, what they call the
association.
PhilPro,
The PhilPro,
Philippine
an
American
initiative
Young
that you
Leaders
wanted
Program.
to propagate. How's that going so far with Vicky?
Oh, doing very well. And I'm so glad that they have continued, because the Philippine Embassy has agreed to continue its partnership with Ayala Foundation. They now have, 11th, on their 11th year. And the last one, that was November, they had 15 of these young outstanding Philippine American leaders. And, you know, they have very impressive credentials. And what's good is that when they go back to the US, they start projects that will help both the Philippines and the US. And for example, one of them is among the first batches, put up a virtual platform to put American businessmen who were looking for local partners who were interested to set up over in the Philippines. And you know, he did more than 200 of these transactions in a span of about 3 years. And so he decided, instead of doing it as a hobby, he made it as business. Now he's done very well. So if you listen to the stories of these people, what they've done after their exposure to the Philippines, it's just so heartwarming that we decided to put up this organization. And what really I'm very happy about is that they have continued. They've set up their own organization. They have officers, and they meet regularly. So it's now that they have over, I think, maybe close to 100 alumni. Maybe, no, more than 100, because it's gone 11 years. Yeah. So I'm very happy about that. And I am proud. It was my wife who said, you should reach out to the young people, because every time I would have meetings in the different consulates, we hardly saw any young people. So I decided to meet with them separately, because they have different objectives, different likes. So, and that was very effective, thanks to my wife. She said, you have to reach out to them. And that's why we came up with that PhilPro program.
What are you most grateful for?
Well, grateful for my family, my faith, my country. Despite all our challenges, I still am very happy. I'm a Filipino. And of course, my friends. So That's quite a lot that I am very grateful to the Almighty.
And what advice would you give the young as you've been approaching them in separate meetings apart from the embassy events? What would you tell them? From an investment banker, you wanted to be one when you were 23, and now you've become a public servant.
Yeah. Well, I was an investment banker for about 10 years because even as early as my junior year in college, I already decided I wanted to be an investment banker. So when I went to Wharton, I took subjects that were really would help me to become an investment banker in preparation for becoming an investment banker. And that really helped. And I enjoyed, I was with Ayala Investment, one of the two investment banks at that time. The other one was Bangkok. And so I enjoyed it for about 10 years. Then I decided to shift. I went into commercial banking, IBAA. And so it was a different, ball game. But I also enjoyed commercial banking. And then I ended up in the central bank, right?
It's the whole spread. So if you were to tell the young who's wanting to blaze a trail in banking and then do public service, what would you tell them?
One of the things I always tell them, I know that many of you are reluctant to work in government because of the problems that you face, all these investigations that are done by the Senate, the House, etc., etc. You get discouraged when you see looking into all sorts of things. But I think you should give it a try. I said I never had any plan to work for government, but I ended up in the Social Security system when President Cory asked me to head the SSS. Then she asked me to move the central bank, and I have to say that even when she offered me central bank, I actually was trying to get away from it, but she didn't allow me. So I took it, and then after that, I was very happy that I did, in fact, accept that governorship because it was a very challenging, but it was also a very satisfying job as a central bank governor. So I always tell them you have to be willing to give it a try, especially because if you can contribute to the country, you should do as much as you can to help the country. No?
Ambassador Joey Cuisia, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much
My
for
pleasure,
being
Cathy.
here on this program.
Pleasure talking to you.
And have a great birthday weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.
Catch us again next Tuesday, 9:30 p.m. Manila time on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I'm Cathy Yang, and this is Thought Leaders.